G'day, mate. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're standing on a creaking wooden deck, salt spray hitting your face, and the stench of unwashed bodies mixed with rotting fish fills your nostrils. You think you're tough? You reckon you could handle the pirate life because you've watched Pirates of the Caribbean a few times? Well, let me tell you something that'll make your comfortable bed feel like a luxury resort. You wouldn't last a single day on a real pirate ship, not even close. Tonight, we're diving deep into the brutal reality of pirate life, where rum wasn't just for celebration, it was literally the only medicine keeping these blokes alive, where a simple cut could mean death, and where your morning routine would include scraping maggots out of your breakfast biscuit. So settle in, get comfortable, because over the next 2 hours, I'm going to tell you exactly why your soft, modern life would crumble faster than a stale ship's biscuit in the harsh reality of the golden age of piracy. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll never look at a pirate movie the same way again. This isn't just another history lesson, mate. This is a survival guide you'll never need for a life you could never handle. Let's start with something your history teacher conveniently left out. The golden age of piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, wasn't some romantic adventure on the high seas. It was a floating apocalypse where desperate men chose a life of certain violence over the grinding poverty of legitimate work. You see, mate, most pirates weren't born criminals dreaming of treasure. They were former sailors, escaped slaves, unemployed soldiers, and men who'd rather face death at sea than starvation on land. The average life expectancy of a pirate was about 28 years old. Think about that for a second. If you're older than 28 right now, you've already outlived most pirates in history. But here's the kicker that'll make you appreciate your morning coffee. These men didn't just die in dramatic sword fights or cannon battles. No, most pirates died from diseases so horrific that modern medicine would put them in isolation wards. Scurvy would literally make your teeth fall out and your old wounds reopen. Dysentery would empty your bowels until you died of dehydration. And gangrene? Well, that meant watching your limbs rot off your body while you were still conscious. Your smartphone has more computing power than entire pirate fleets had navigational equipment. These blokes were sailing across oceans using wooden instruments, dead reckoning, and prayers to gods they'd probably offended. They couldn't even predict the weather beyond looking at the sky and hoping for the best. The ships themselves were floating death traps. The average pirate vessel was overcrowded, poorly maintained, and structurally unsound. Imagine living in a wooden box that's constantly leaking, surrounded by 50 to 100 other unwashed men, with no privacy, no fresh water, and food that was already rotting when it came aboard. And here's something that would absolutely destroy your modern sensibilities. There was no concept of personal space or hygiene. You'd be sleeping in a hammock inches away from someone else's feet, sharing the same eating utensils that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, and using communal buckets for, well, everything. The famous pirate code wasn't some noble set of guidelines. It was a desperate attempt to prevent these violent, desperate men from murdering each other before they could find their next target. These codes included rules about when you could and couldn't kill your crewmates, how to divide loot fairly enough to prevent mutiny, and what to do when someone inevitably went mad from the isolation and constant threat of death. Pirates weren't the swashbuckling heroes Hollywood portrays. They were often brutal, desperate men who tortured prisoners for information, raped and murdered civilians, and would sell their own mothers for a decent meal and a bottle of rum. The famous pirate Blackbeard once shot his own first mate in the knee during dinner, just to remind everyone who was in charge. But perhaps the most disturbing truth about pirate life was this. Many of them knew they were living on borrowed time, and they simply didn't care anymore. They'd chosen a life where every day might be their last, where violence was currency, and where the only comfort came from a bottle of rum that was probably more alcohol than water. Let me tell you about Thomas Whitmore, a 19-year-old surgeon's apprentice who found himself aboard Captain Samuel Bellamy's ship, the Whydah, in 1717. Thomas thought his medical training would make him valuable, maybe even give him some protection. Poor bastard had no idea what he was walking into. You see, being a surgeon on a pirate ship didn't mean you had a sterile operating room and modern instruments. Thomas's medical kit consisted of a rusty saw, some fishing hooks he'd bent into, surgical needles, a bottle of rum for anesthesia, and whatever herbs he could scrounge up at ports. His operating table was usually a wooden barrel or a plank stretched between two cannons. On Thomas's third day aboard, a gunner named Big Mike took a musket ball to the shoulder during a raid. Now, in our modern world, this would be a trip to the emergency room, some antibiotics, maybe a bit of physical therapy. For Thomas, it became a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his very short life. The musket ball had lodged deep in Mike's shoulder blade, and infection was already setting in. Thomas knew that without proper tools and conditions, attempting surgery would likely kill the man. But here's the thing about pirate ships. Showing weakness or refusing to help a crewmate was often a death sentence in itself. Picture this scene. Below deck, lit only by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The air thick with the smell of gunpowder, unwashed bodies, and the sweet, sickly scent of blood. Thomas had Mike pinned down by 3 other pirates while he tried to dig out the musket ball with a knife he'd heated in a candle flame. Mike's screams echoed through the ship as Thomas carved into his shoulder, following the path of the bullet, by feel alone. There was no anesthesia except for the rum they'd forced down Mike's throat, and even that was running low. Blood was everywhere. On Thomas's hands, pooling on the deck, spattering across his face as Mike thrashed in agony. After what felt like hours, Thomas finally found the musket ball. But by then, Mike had lost so much blood that his skin had turned gray and his breathing was shallow and ragged. Thomas packed the wound with whatever clean cloth he could find, which wasn't much, and tried to stitch it closed with fishing line. Mike survived the surgery, but within a week, gangrene had set in. Thomas watched helplessly as green and black rot spread from the wound site. The smell was indescribable, like meat left in the sun for days, mixed with the acidic stench of infection. Mike begged Thomas to cut off his arm, but Thomas knew that without proper tools or conditions, amputation would definitely kill him. So Mike died slowly, over the course of 10 agonizing days, while Thomas tried everything he could think of. He poured rum into the wound, applied maggots to eat the dead flesh, even tried cauterizing the infection with a red-hot iron. Nothing worked. Mike died delirious with fever, calling out for his mother and begging for someone to end his suffering. But that was just the beginning of Thomas's education in maritime medicine. 2 weeks later, during a particularly violent storm, a sailor named Jamie fell from the rigging and landed hard on the deck. His leg was bent at an impossible angle, bone protruding through the skin. In modern times, this would be a complex but manageable fracture. For Thomas, it was another impossible choice. The crew gathered around as Thomas examined Jamie's leg. The bone had snapped cleanly in two, and without proper setting, Jamie would never walk again, assuming he survived at all. Pirates who couldn't work usually didn't last long. They were seen as dead weight that consumed precious food and water. Thomas knew he had to attempt to set the bone, but he had no proper splints, no pain medication, and certainly no sterile conditions. He had Jamie bite down on a leather strap and began the gruesome process of pulling the bone back into alignment. The sound of bone grinding against bone is something that stays with you forever. Jamie passed out from the pain, which was probably a mercy. Thomas managed to get the bone roughly aligned and splinted it with pieces of broken wood and strips of sailcloth. But without proper immobilization or antibiotics, infection was almost inevitable. Jamie's leg became a testament to, the brutality of shipboard medicine. Despite Thomas's best efforts, the wound became infected, and Jamie developed a fever that lasted for weeks. The leg healed, but it healed wrong, shorter than the other leg and bent at an odd angle. Jamie would limp for the rest of his life, which turned out to be about 6 more months before he was killed in a raid. But the case that broke Thomas's spirit completely was little Billy Henderson, a 14-year-old boy who'd been pressed into service. Billy was everyone's favorite. He had a quick smile, could play the fiddle, and reminded many of the pirates of younger brothers or sons they'd left behind. Billy came down with what we'd now recognize as appendicitis. The pain started gradually, then became excruciating. Billy couldn't stand upright, couldn't eat, and developed a high fever. Thomas had heard of cases like this from his medical training, but he'd never seen one personally. The only treatment Thomas knew for this condition was surgery to remove the infected organ. But performing abdominal surgery on a 14-year-old boy, on a ship at sea, with no proper instruments or sterile conditions. It was essentially a death sentence. Thomas agonized over the decision for 2 days while Billy's condition worsened. The boy was delirious with fever, crying for his mother, begging Thomas to make the pain stop. The other pirates were getting restless. A sick boy meant bad luck, and some were starting to suggest more permanent solutions to the problem. Finally, Thomas decided he had to try. If he did nothing, Billy would certainly die. If he attempted surgery, there was at least a small chance the boy might survive. The operation was a horror beyond description. Thomas had Billy held down by 4 men while he cut into the boy's abdomen with a knife that had been heated in the galley fire. Billy's screams were so intense that even hardened pirates had to leave the area. Blood poured from the incision as Thomas tried to locate the infected organ by feel alone. When Thomas finally found what he thought was the appendix, it had already burst. Infection had spread throughout Billy's abdominal cavity. Thomas tried to clean out as much as he could, but without proper surgical tools or antibiotics, it was hopeless. Billy lingered for 3 more days, his abdomen swollen and hard, his fever climbing higher and higher. Thomas sat with him constantly, trying to ease his pain with rum and cool cloths, knowing that every breath might be the boy's last. When Billy finally died, Thomas had been on the ship for exactly 30 days. In that time, he'd watched 3 people die horrible, preventable deaths, and he'd been powerless to save any of them. The psychological toll was devastating. This soft, educated young man had been thrust into a world where death was casual and suffering was routine. Thomas himself would die just 2 months later when the Wida ran aground in a storm off Cape Cod. His body was never recovered, but historical records show that he was found clutching his medical bag, still trying to help his crewmates even as the ship broke apart around him. That's what real pirate medicine looked like, mate. No heroic healing montages, no miraculous recoveries. Just desperate men doing terrible things to each other in the name of survival, while boys barely old enough to shave died in agony because they'd been born into the wrong century. Now let me tell you about something your pirate movies never show you: the brutal economics of piracy. This is the story of William Black Bill Morrison, quartermaster aboard the ship Devil's Providence under Captain Marcus Kane in 1714. Being a quartermaster on a pirate ship wasn't about managing supplies, it was about managing violence. You were responsible for dividing loot, settling disputes, and most importantly, deciding who lived and who died when resources ran low. Bill Morrison was very, very good at his job, which made him one of the most hated men on the 7 seas. Let me paint you a picture of Bill's typical morning routine, something that would probably send you running back to your day job faster than you could say corporate restructuring. First, Bill would inspect the ship's water barrels. Fresh water was more valuable than gold on long voyages, and it went bad quickly in wooden barrels. Imagine opening a container and being hit with the smell of stagnant pond water mixed with dead insects and algae. That's what passed for drinking water after a few weeks at sea. Bill had to decide daily who got clean water and who got the rancid stuff. Officers and skilled sailors got the better water. New crew members, prisoners, and anyone who'd fallen out of favor got whatever was left. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about survival. Clean water meant you might live long enough to see the next port. Bad water meant dysentery, dehydration, and probably death. But water was nothing compared to the food situation. Your worst airplane meal would seem like a 5-star restaurant compared to ship's biscuits that had been at sea for months. These weren't just stale, they were literally crawling with weevils and maggots. The sailors would tap them on the table before eating to shake out the bugs, but after a while, they just gave up and ate the protein along with the carbs. Bill kept meticulous records of everything. How many weevils per biscuit was acceptable? About 15. How green the salt pork could be before it was completely inedible. Quite green, actually. And how to stretch food supplies when they were running low. When food ran short, Bill had to make decisions that would haunt anyone with a conscience. I'm talking about real, calculated decisions about who would starve so that others might live. New crew members were always the first to have their rations cut. Sick or injured pirates who couldn't work were next. Anyone who'd crossed the captain or the crew found their food mysteriously running out faster than everyone else's. Bill once had to manage supplies during a 6-week period when the ship was becalmed in the Caribbean. No wind meant no movement, and their planned raid on a Spanish galleon had to be postponed indefinitely. Food and water were running dangerously low, and the crew was becoming increasingly desperate and violent. This is where Bill's particular talents became apparent. He implemented what he called the productivity ration system. Your daily food allocation was directly tied to how useful you were to the ship's operations. The captain and officers got full rations. Skilled sailors like the navigator, the gunner, and the cook got 3/4 rations. Regular crew members got half rations. And the expendables, mostly new recruits and prisoners they'd picked up in recent raids, got whatever was left over, which was usually nothing. Within 2 weeks, 3 men had died from starvation and dehydration. Bill recorded their deaths in his ledger with the same clinical detachment he used to track supplies. J. Williams, deceased, rations redistributed. Their bodies were thrown overboard without ceremony, and their personal belongings were added to the ship's general stores. But the most horrifying part wasn't the deaths themselves. It was how quickly the surviving crew adapted to the new reality. Men who had been friends began hoarding food scraps. Alliances formed and dissolved based on who had access to extra rations. Some crew members started informing on others, hoping to move up in the food chain, literally. Bill instituted a point system for rations. You could earn extra food by volunteering for dangerous tasks, providing useful information, or informing on crew members who were breaking the ship's rules. You could lose points by getting sick, making mistakes, or simply being unlucky enough to anger someone higher up in the hierarchy. One young sailor named Peter Hayes tried to steal an extra biscuit from the stores. Under normal circumstances, this might have earned him a flogging or extra duties. But during the famine period, theft of food was a capital offense. Bill didn't even hesitate. He marked Peter's name off the ration list and informed the captain. Peter was given a choice: walk the plank immediately, or be marooned on a small island they'd passed 3 days earlier. Peter chose the island, thinking he might have a chance to survive until another ship came by. Bill noted in his ledger that Peter's remaining food rations would be distributed among the surviving crew. They never found out what happened to Peter, but Bill estimated his chances of survival at approximately 0. The island had no fresh water, no food sources, and was regularly hit by tropical storms. Peter had essentially chosen to die slowly rather than quickly. By the time the wind picked up and they could resume their voyage, 7 men had died from starvation, dehydration, or diseases brought on by malnutrition. The surviving crew was so weak that they could barely operate the ship. When they finally encountered a merchant vessel, they were in no condition to fight. They had to essentially beg for food and water, trading away most of their existing loot, just to avoid starvation. But here's the part that would really mess with your modern sensibilities. Bill Morrison wasn't considered a villain by pirate standards. He was considered an excellent quartermaster because he'd kept more crew members alive than most ships managed in similar situations. His cold, calculating approach to resource management was seen as a valuable skill, not a moral failing. Bill's ledger, which was recovered when the Devil's Providence was finally captured by the Royal Navy, contained detailed records of over 200 deaths that he'd either directly caused or allowed to happen through resource allocation decisions. Each death was recorded with the same matter-of-fact notation: cause of death, remaining useful items, and impact on ship operations. The Royal Navy prosecutor, who read Bill's ledger during his trial, noted that it was the most coldly methodical record of human suffering he'd ever encountered. Bill was hanged 3 weeks later, but not before he'd requested that his ledger be preserved as a useful guide for future maritime quartermasters. Even facing execution, Bill couldn't understand why people were so upset about his methods. In his mind, he'd simply done what was necessary to keep the ship operational and as many crew members alive as possible. The fact that his decisions had caused immense suffering and death was just an unfortunate but unavoidable side effect of life at sea. That's the reality of pirate economics, mate. Every meal, every drink of water, every moment of rest was calculated against the survival of the group. Your individual suffering meant nothing compared to the ship's operational efficiency, and men like Bill Morrison were the ones making those calculations, day after day, until it turned them into something that barely resembled human beings anymore. Here's a story they definitely didn't teach you in school. The tale of Isabella Rodriguez, one of the few female pirates who actually existed, and her absolutely catastrophic attempt to navigate the Atlantic in 1719. What happened to her crew over 60 days of being completely lost at sea will make you grateful for GPS, weather apps, and literally any form of modern technology. Isabella wasn't your typical pirate. She'd been a Spanish noblewoman who fled to the Caribbean after killing her abusive husband in what was probably self-defense. But try explaining that to the Spanish Inquisition. She'd learned navigation from Moorish sailors in Cadiz before her life went sideways, and she was actually quite skilled with the traditional instruments of the era. But being skilled with 18th century navigation equipment was like being good at performing surgery with a butter knife. It might work under perfect conditions, but when things went wrong, they went very, very wrong. Isabella had assembled a crew of 73 men aboard a stolen Spanish frigate called La Venganza. They'd been quite successful for about 8 months, raiding shipping routes between Spain and the New World. But success made them cocky, and cocky pirates make fatal mistakes. In March of 1719, Isabella decided to attempt something incredibly ambitious. A direct crossing from the Canary Islands to Jamaica, bypassing the usual island-hopping routes that most pirates used. This would cut weeks off their journey and allow them to hit Spanish treasure fleets that weren't expecting pirates. In those waters, the problem? This route took them through some of the most unpredictable waters in the Atlantic during storm season, with navigation instruments that were basically educated guesswork devices. For the first week, everything went perfectly. The weather was good. The winds were favorable, and Isabella's calculations seemed spot on. The crew was in high spirits, already planning what they'd do with their next haul. Some were talking about retiring to Madagascar. Others wanted to buy their own ships and start their own cruise. Then the storms hit. Not just one storm, a series of 3 massive tempests that kept them battered and off course for almost 2 weeks. When the weather finally cleared, Isabella made a horrifying discovery. She had absolutely no idea where they were. You see, navigation in that era depended on being able to see the stars and the sun to calculate your position. After 2 weeks of clouds and storms, with the ship being blown off course constantly, Isabella's dead reckoning calculations were completely useless. They could be anywhere in a several thousand square mile area of the Atlantic Ocean. Isabella tried everything she could think of. She attempted to calculate their position based on wind patterns, ocean currents, even the behavior of seabirds. But without any fixed reference points, she was essentially guessing. And with each passing day, the margin of error grew larger and larger. By day 15, it became clear that they were seriously lost. The crew was getting nervous, but Isabella projected confidence she didn't feel. Privately, she was terrified. She kept meticulous notes in her journal, which was later recovered, and you can see her growing desperation in every entry. Day 16. Still no sight of land. Crew beginning to ask questions. Told them we're making good time toward Jamaica. Truth is, we could be sailing toward Africa for all I know. Water supplies adequate for now, but if we don't find land soon. The psychological pressure on Isabella was immense. She was the only person on the ship who could navigate, which meant she was responsible for the lives of 73 men who trusted her completely. But she was working with instruments that would be considered primitive by modern standards, in conditions that would challenge even modern GPS systems. By day 20, the first signs of real trouble appeared. They'd been rationing water carefully, but their supplies were running lower than anyone wanted to admit. The crew was still relatively calm, but Isabella could see the way they looked at her. Expectant, trusting, completely unaware that she was as lost as they were. Isabella made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She decided to change course based on a complete guess. She thought they might be too far north, so she ordered the ship to head southwest. It was pure speculation, but she had to do something. Day 25. Changed course to southwest. Crew seems pleased that we're adjusting our route. If I'm wrong, I've just sentenced us all to death. But doing nothing was also a death sentence. God help us all. Days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched toward a month. The water situation became critical. They were down to less than a cup per person per day, and even that was barely drinkable. The barrels had developed a green scum that tasted like death and made men violently ill. Isabella had to make impossible decisions about water rationing. She gave herself the same rations as the crew, but as the navigator, she arguably needed to stay sharp more than anyone else. Some crew members suggested she should get extra water to keep her thinking clearly. Others argued that everyone should share equally, regardless of their role. The food situation was even worse. They'd been at sea for over a month on what was supposed to be a 2-week journey. The ship's biscuits were not just infested with weevils, they'd become a writhing mass of insects and larvae. The salt pork had gone completely rancid and was literally green with mold. Men started getting sick from malnutrition and dehydration. The first death came on day 32, a young sailor named Miguel, who'd been complaining of stomach pains for days. He died in agony, his body too weak to fight off what was probably a simple infection. Isabella recorded his death in her journal. Miguel Santos deceased, buried at sea. Crew morale declining. Some men looking at me with suspicion. Beginning to realize they think this is my fault. They're right. By day 40, they'd lost 8 men to various combinations of disease, dehydration, and despair. But the worst part wasn't the deaths. It was watching strong, confident men slowly lose their minds. Sailors started seeing land on the horizon that wasn't there. Men who'd been friends for years began fighting over scraps of moldy food. Some crew members became convinced that Isabella was deliberately keeping them lost, either because she was working for the Spanish government or because she'd gone mad with power. A group of about 15 men approached Isabella on day 43 with what they called a proposal. They wanted her to admit that she was lost and hand over navigation duties to Eduardo Santos, an older sailor who claimed he'd navigated ships before joining the crew. Isabella knew that Eduardo had no real navigation experience. He'd been a cook on merchant vessels before turning to piracy. But she also knew that admitting her failures might trigger a full mutiny. She agreed to let Eduardo assist with navigation while she maintained overall control. It was a disaster. Eduardo's navigation consisted mainly of praying to various saints and attempting to divine direction based on cloud formations. Within 3 days, it was obvious to everyone that he was just as lost as Isabella, but now the crew had lost faith in both of them. Day 47. Eduardo's attempts at navigation have made things worse. We're now heading due east, which will take us toward Africa if we maintain this course. Tried to explain this to crew, but they're beyond rational discussion. Several men talking openly about killing me and Eduardo to break the curse. The psychological breakdown accelerated after that. Men started having conversations with dead crew members. Others became convinced that they were already dead and sailing through purgatory. One sailor, a normally rational man named Felipe, became obsessed with the idea that they could reach land by sailing straight up. He spent hours trying to convince people to point the ship directly at the sky. Food riots broke out on day 52, when it was discovered that one of the officers had been hoarding an extra barrel of water. 3 men were stabbed in the fighting, and 1 died from his wounds. Isabella had to restore order by threatening to throw the hoarded water overboard if the fighting didn't stop. But the most horrifying development was the conversations about cannibalism that started around day 55. It began as dark jokes, then became serious discussions about survival ethics. Some men argued that eating the bodies of crew members who'd already died was acceptable. Others insisted that they should wait until someone volunteered to sacrifice themselves for the good of the group. Isabella recorded these conversations in her journal, with a detachment that suggests she was starting to lose her grip on reality as well. Crew discussing consumption of human flesh. Logical from survival standpoint, but morally horrifying. Wonder if I'll still think it's horrifying in another week. Salvation came on day 61, completely by accident. A lookout spotted what he thought was a large bird, but turned out to be the sail of a Dutch merchant vessel. The Dutch captain later described finding a ship full of walking skeletons who cried when they saw us. When Isabella's crew was rescued, they'd been reduced from 73 men to 31 survivors. Many of the survivors were so psychologically damaged that they never fully recovered. Several spent the rest of their lives in asylums, unable to cope with normal society after their ordeal. Isabella herself survived physically, but she never navigated another ship. She settled in Port Royal and spent her remaining years as a tavern keeper, drinking heavily and telling anyone who would listen that modern navigation instruments were tools of the devil designed to give men false confidence in their ability to master the sea. Her journal, which was preserved by the Dutch captain who rescued them, contains this final entry. Learned today that we were approximately 400 miles from Jamaica when the Dutch found us. If I had maintained my original course instead of changing direction on day 25, we would have reached land 3 weeks ago. My decision to change course killed 42 men. I am a murderer who will never be tried for her crimes. Isabella Rodriguez died in 1731, 12 years after her ordeal. According to contemporary accounts, she never spent a single night more than a mile from shore for the rest of her life. Now I want to tell you about the youngest member of most pirate crews, the powder monkeys. These were usually boys between 8 and 14 years old whose job was to run gunpowder from the ship's magazine to the cannons during battle. It sounds like a simple enough job, doesn't it? Well, let me tell you about Samuel Little Sam McBride, and you'll understand why being a powder monkey was essentially a death sentence with a very short expiration date. Sam was 11 years old when he was pressed into service aboard Captain Irontooth Morgan's ship, the Crimson Revenge, in 1716. He wasn't an orphan seeking adventure. He was the son of a blacksmith in Port Royal who made the mistake of being in the wrong place when Morgan's crew was looking for new recruits. You see, powder monkeys weren't usually volunteers. They were kidnapped children, the sons of families who couldn't protect them, or boys who'd been sold into service by parents who couldn't afford to feed them. The pirates preferred children for this job because they were small enough to move quickly through the cramped spaces of a ship, and, though they'd never admit it out loud, they were considered expendable. Picture little Sam on his first day, aboard the Crimson Revenge. He's a small boy, probably weighing about 70 pounds, standing on the deck of a ship full of grown men who smell like death and look like nightmares. His job training consisted of about 10 minutes of instruction from the previous powder monkey, a 13-year-old named Jack who'd already lost 2 fingers to a cannon misfire. "Listen, boy," Jack told him. "When the shooting starts, you run from the magazine to the cannons as fast as you can. Don't drop the powder, don't trip, and don't get in anyone's way. The powder kegs are heavy, and if you can't carry them fast enough, the gunners will beat you. If you drop one and it spills, they'll probably kill you. And whatever you do, never ever let any sparks near the gunpowder." That was it. That was Sam's entire education for one of the most dangerous jobs on a pirate ship. The gunpowder magazine was located in the lowest part of the ship, below the waterline, surrounded by thick wooden walls designed to contain explosions. It was always dark, always damp, and always filled with barrels of black powder that could explode if they got wet, if they got too hot, or if someone looked at them wrong. Sam's daily routine involved checking the powder barrels for moisture, rats, or any signs of deterioration. Black powder in that era wasn't the stable, reliable explosive we think of today. It was a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur that could become dangerously unstable under the damp, hot conditions of a ship's hold. But the real terror began during Sam's first battle, just 3 weeks after joining the crew. The Crimson Revenge encountered a Spanish merchant vessel carrying silver from the New World. It should have been an easy target. The merchant ship had only 6 cannons, compared to the Revenge's 18. When the call came for battle stations, Sam felt his heart start racing. The ship's bell was ringing, men were shouting, and the sound of cannons being rolled into position echoed through the hull like thunder. This was what he'd been dreading since the day he was brought aboard. The gunpowder charges for the cannons were stored in leather cartridges, each containing exactly the right amount of powder for one shot. Sam's job was to grab a cartridge from the magazine, run it up 2 levels of the ship to the cannon deck, deliver it to the gunners, and then run back for another one. Simple, right? What they didn't tell Sam was that during battle, the ship would be constantly moving, rolling with the waves and the recoil of its own cannons. What they didn't tell him was that the cannon deck would be filled with smoke so thick he could barely see 3 feet in front of him. What they didn't tell him was that enemy cannonballs would be crashing through the ship's hull, sending deadly wooden splinters flying in every direction. Sam's first trip from the magazine to the cannons took him through a hell he couldn't have imagined. The ship was rolling violently as it maneuvered for position, and he had to climb a ladder while carrying a 15-pound cartridge of gunpowder. The smoke from the cannons was so thick that he couldn't breathe properly, and the noise was so loud that he couldn't hear the gunners shouting instructions. When Sam finally reached the cannon deck, he found chaos. Men were loading and firing the cannons as fast as possible, their faces blackened with gunpowder, their eyes wild with battle fury. The deck was slippery with blood from wounded sailors, and the air was filled with the screams of injured men and the roar of cannons. A gunner, named Pete, grabbed the cartridge from Sam's hands and immediately started yelling for another one. Sam turned to run back to the magazine, but at that moment a Spanish cannonball crashed through the hull just a few feet away from him. The explosion was indescribable. The cannonball tore through the wooden wall like it was paper, sending splinters of wood flying like daggers. 3 sailors were killed instantly, their bodies literally torn apart by the wooden shrapnel. Sam was thrown against the opposite wall, his ears ringing so loudly that he couldn't hear anything else. But Sam couldn't stop. The gunners needed powder, and if he didn't deliver it, the ship might be lost. With blood running down his face, from cuts caused by flying splinters, Sam made his way back to the magazine for another cartridge. The second trip was worse than the first. Another cannonball had struck the ship, this one near the mainmast, and the entire vessel was listing to one side. Sam had to fight gravity as well as his own terror as he climbed the ladder with another powder charge. By the time he reached the cannon deck again, 2 more gunners had been wounded. One man was trying to load a cannon with his left hand because his right arm had been mangled by an explosion. Another was lying on the deck screaming, with a wooden splinter the size of a sword protruding from his leg. Sam delivered his powder charge and turned to go back for another, but this time he didn't make it. As he was climbing down the ladder to the magazine, the ship took another hit, this one close enough to throw him off the ladder entirely. Sam fell about 8 feet, landing hard on his back and knocking the wind out of his lungs. For a moment, Sam lay there gasping, unable to move, unable to breathe. Above him, he could hear the battle continuing, cannons firing, men screaming, the sound of wood splintering under the impact of enemy fire. But all he could think about was how much he wanted to go home to his father's blacksmith shop, where the worst thing that could happen was burning his hand on hot metal. But there was no going home. Sam forced himself to get up, grabbed another powder charge, and started climbing back toward the cannon deck. This time, when he reached the top of the ladder, he found that one of the cannons had exploded. Cannon explosions were a constant danger on pirate ships. The cannons were often old, poorly maintained, and pushed beyond their safe operating limits. When a cannon exploded, it sent chunks of hot metal flying in every direction, turning the gun crew into hamburger meat. Sam stared at the remains of the gun crew, 5 men who'd been laughing and joking with him just an hour earlier. Now they were scattered across the deck in pieces too small to identify. The smell of burned flesh mixed with gunpowder smoke created an odor that Sam would never forget. The battle lasted 4 more hours. By the time it was over, Sam had made 23 trips between the magazine and the cannon deck. He'd been cut by flying splinters, burned by sparks from the cannons, and nearly killed by falling debris at least half a dozen times. But he'd survived, which made him luckier than most powder monkeys. Of the 3 boys who'd started the battle, Sam was the only one still alive. Little Pete had been killed by a cannonball in the first hour. Jack, the boy who'd trained Sam, had been crushed when a cannon broke loose from its moorings and rolled across the deck. When the fighting ended and the Spanish ship surrendered, Sam found himself sitting on the bloody deck, still holding a powder charge he'd never delivered. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold on to it. One of the surviving gunners, a man named Carlos, sat down next to him. "First battle's always the worst, boy," Carlos said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the cannon fire. "You did good. Most powder monkeys don't last 10 minutes in their first fight." Sam looked at Carlos with wide, terrified eyes. "How many battles have there been?" he asked. Carlos thought for a moment. "In the 2 years I've been on this ship, maybe 40 or 50. We fight about twice a month, sometimes more if we're in busy shipping lanes." Sam did the math in his head. 40 or 50 battles, with a new powder monkey every few fights. He was looking at a life expectancy measured in weeks, not years. And this had just been a small merchant vessel with light armament. What would happen when they encountered a well-armed warship or a Spanish treasure galleon with experienced gunners? Little Sam McBride survived exactly 7 more battles over the next 3 months. His luck ran out during a raid on a Portuguese slave ship off the coast of Brazil. A stray spark from an overheated cannon ignited the powder charge he was carrying, killing him instantly and severely burning 2 other crew members. Sam was 12 years old when he died. He'd been a powder monkey for exactly 127 days. The ship's log recorded his death with typical pirate brevity. S. McBride, powder monkey, deceased by explosion. No next of kin to notify. But here's the most horrifying part of Sam's story. He was considered one of the successful powder monkeys. He'd lasted longer than most boys in that position, and he'd never made a major mistake that cost the ship a battle. In the brutal world of pirate ships, little Sam McBride was a success story. The average life expectancy of a powder monkey was about 6 weeks. Most died in their first or second battle, killed by enemy fire, exploding cannons, or simple accidents in the chaos of combat. The few who survived long enough to grow into adult crew members were considered incredibly lucky. And here's something that would absolutely horrify your modern sensibilities. These children weren't just random victims. They were an integral part of pirate ship operations. Without powder monkeys, the cannons couldn't fire fast enough to be effective in battle. These boys were literally the difference between victory and defeat, between capturing a prize and ending up at the bottom of the ocean. The pirates knew they were sending children to their deaths, and they did it anyway because it was necessary for their survival. Some captains tried to find older, stronger boys who might last longer. Others preferred younger children because they were more obedient and less likely to desert at the next port. But none of them lost sleep over the moral implications of using child soldiers in naval warfare. It was just another harsh reality of life at sea, like disease, starvation, and violent death. Children were a resource to be used up and replaced, nothing more. That's the reality that little Sam McBride lived and died with. Not the romanticized adventure of pirate movies, but the cold, brutal calculus of maritime warfare, where 11-year-old boys carried explosives through combat zones because grown men needed someone expendable to do the job. For our final story, let me tell you about Captain Ezekiel Kane, known to his crew as the Preacher, a man who started as a respected naval officer and ended as something that barely qualified as human. His 90-day transformation from decorated captain to homicidal madman will show you exactly what the isolation and pressure of pirate life could do to even the strongest minds. Kane had been a captain in the Royal Navy for 15 years before he turned to piracy. He was educated, well-respected, and known for his fair treatment of his crew. But in 1718, Kane made a decision that would damn him and everyone who followed him. He stole his own ship, the HMS Retribution, along with its crew of 89 men, and declared himself a pirate captain. What drove Kane to piracy wasn't greed or bloodlust, it was desperation. His family estate in England had been seized for debt. His wife had died of consumption, and his 2 children had been placed in a workhouse. The Royal Navy, which he'd served faithfully for most of his adult life, had refused his requests for additional pay or shore leave to deal with his family crisis. Kane's initial plan was relatively modest. He would use the Retribution to capture a few Spanish treasure ships, accumulate enough wealth to buy back his family estate and rescue his children, then disappear to a quiet life somewhere in the American colonies. It was the sort of desperate plan that might have worked if Kane had been dealing with normal circumstances and a stable crew. But Kane wasn't prepared for what piracy would do to his mind, and he certainly wasn't prepared for the psychological challenges of commanding men who'd followed him into what was essentially a life of exile and certain death. The first few weeks went well. Kane's naval training made him an excellent tactical commander, and the Retribution was a powerful warship compared to the merchant vessels they encountered. They captured 3 Spanish ships in their first month, accumulating a respectable amount of gold and silver. But success brought its own problems. Kane's crew was composed of former Royal Navy sailors who'd followed him into piracy more out of loyalty than greed. These weren't hardened pirates. They were disciplined military men who were suddenly living outside the law with no possibility of ever returning to their former lives. The psychological pressure began to manifest in Kane's behavior around day 30. He started holding daily prayer services on deck, something he'd never done during his naval career. But these weren't normal military chaplain services. They were long, rambling sermons about sin, redemption, and divine punishment. Cain became obsessed with the idea that their piracy was a test from God, and that they would only be forgiven if they conducted themselves according to strict religious principles. He instituted a series of increasingly bizarre rules. No cursing, no gambling, no drinking except for communion wine, and mandatory prayer sessions 3 times a day. The crew initially tolerated these eccentricities because Cain was still an effective captain. But as the weeks passed, his religious obsessions became more extreme and more intrusive. Cain began conducting confessions, where crew members were required to admit their sins in front of the entire ship. Men who refused to participate were punished with reduced rations or extra duties. By day 45, Cain had instituted what he called divine justice for crew members who violated his religious rules. A sailor caught gambling lost a finger. A man who cursed during prayer service was flogged. And anyone who questioned Cain's religious authority was locked in the ship's brig on bread and water. But the truly horrifying transformation began when Cain started claiming that God was speaking to him directly, giving him guidance about their mission and their targets. These weren't vague spiritual insights. Cain claimed to be receiving specific tactical instructions from divine voices. Cain's first mate, a practical man named William Foster, later described the captain's behavior during this period. He would stand at the bow of the ship for hours, having conversations with people who weren't there. Sometimes he would laugh, sometimes he would argue, but always he would come back with new orders that he claimed came from God himself. The religious services became increasingly bizarre. Cain started speaking in tongues, claiming that he was channeling ancient prophets. He instituted ritual purifications that involved crew members stripping naked and being doused with seawater, while Cain prayed over them. Men who showed any sign of reluctance were accused of harboring demons. By day 60, Cain had divided his crew into the saved and the damned. The saved were men who participated enthusiastically in his religious rituals and supported his increasingly extreme decisions. The damned were anyone who showed skepticism, asked questions, or failed to demonstrate sufficient religious fervor. The damned were subjected to increasingly harsh punishments. They were given the worst food, the most dangerous duties, and were often beaten for minor infractions. Cain claimed that their suffering was necessary to purge them of sin and bring them closer to salvation. But Cain's madness reached its peak during what he called the Great Purification, which began on day 73. Cain announced that God had revealed to him that their ship was infected with evil spirits, and that these spirits could only be driven out through extreme measures. Cain ordered the entire crew to fast for 3 days, while he conducted exorcism rituals on every part of the ship. Men who showed signs of weakness during the fast were accused of being possessed by demons. Cain would tie these men to the mast and perform exorcisms that involved beating them with ropes while screaming biblical passages. During one of these sessions, Cain became convinced that the ship's cat was possessed by Satan. He killed the animal with his bare hands, then ordered the crew to pray over its corpse for 6 hours while he searched for signs of demonic influence in its entrails. The crew was beginning to realize that their captain had completely lost his mind, but they were trapped on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with no way to escape. Mutiny was an option, but Cain still had loyalists among the crew, and anyone caught plotting against him would certainly be killed. The breaking point came on day 81 when Cain announced that God had commanded him to sacrifice one crew member to ensure the ship's salvation. Cain claimed that the sacrifice had to be voluntary and that God would reveal which crew member was chosen through divine signs. Cain spent 3 days interpreting omens to determine who should be sacrificed. He examined everything from the pattern of bird flights to the way the wind filled the sails, looking for divine guidance. Finally, he announced that God had chosen Timothy Walsh, a 19-year-old sailor who'd joined the crew just before they turned to piracy. Walsh refused to submit to sacrifice, which Cain interpreted as proof that the young man was possessed by demons. Cain ordered the crew to capture Walsh and prepare him for purification through holy fire. This was too much for even Cain's most loyal followers. First Mate Foster and 6 other crew members attempted to restrain the captain and take control of the ship. The result was a bloody battle that left 5 men dead, and Cain barricaded in his cabin with his remaining loyalists. For the next 9 days, the retribution was essentially a floating battleground. Cain and his loyalists controlled the stern of the ship, including the captain's cabin and the armory. Foster's group controlled the bow and the ship's wheel. Neither side had enough men to decisively defeat the other, so they settled into a siege mentality. Kane's behavior during this period became even more erratic. He claimed that the mutineers were agents of Satan sent to test his faith. He conducted elaborate rituals to purify his section of the ship, which involved burning anything he considered tainted by evil influences. The standoff ended on day 90, when Kane's group ran out of fresh water. Rather than surrender, Kane announced that God had commanded him to cleanse the ship with holy fire. He set fire to the ship's magazine, apparently intending to blow up the entire vessel as a sacrifice to God. Foster's group managed to extinguish the fire before it reached the gunpowder, but not before Kane had killed himself with his service pistol. His final words, according to Foster's testimony, were, "God forgives those who serve him faithfully, even unto death." When the smoke cleared, only 31 men survived out of the original crew of 89. Most had been killed in the various battles and purges that marked Kane's descent into madness. The survivors were so traumatized that many never sailed again, preferring to take their chances on land rather than risk another voyage with a mad captain. The Royal Navy's investigation into the retribution incident concluded that Captain Kane had suffered a complete psychological breakdown brought on by the stress of command, isolation, and guilt over his decision to turn to piracy. But they missed the larger point. Kane's madness wasn't unique. The isolation, pressure, and moral compromises required by pirate life drove many captains to similar breakdowns. The difference was that most pirate crews were experienced enough to recognize the warning signs and deal with mad captains before they could cause too much damage. Kane's crew, being former naval personnel, were too disciplined and loyal to act quickly enough. Kane's story illustrates something that pirate movies never show you: the psychological toll of command in an environment where violence was routine, morality was flexible, and death was always just one mistake away. Even strong, educated, experienced men could crack under that pressure. And here's the most disturbing part. Ezekiel Kane lasted longer than most pirate captains before his breakdown. The average tenure for a pirate captain was about 18 months. Before they were killed, captured, or driven mad by the pressure, Kane managed 90 days, which put him somewhere in the middle range. The successful pirate captains, the ones who lasted years and accumulated legendary reputations, weren't the ones who maintained their sanity. They were the ones who learned to function effectively without sanity, who could make life and death decisions based on cold calculation rather than human emotion. That's what real pirate leadership looked like, mate. Not swashbuckling heroes with hearts of gold, but desperate men balancing on the edge of madness, making decisions that would horrify anyone with a conscience, and doing it all while maintaining enough charisma to keep their crews from mutinying. Captain Ezekiel Kane started as a good man trying to save his family. 90 days later, he was a religious fanatic who tried to burn down his own ship rather than admit that his holy mission had failed. That transformation, from hero to monster, was the hidden cost of the pirate life that no adventure story ever talks about. And there you have it, mate. 5 stories of survival, failure, madness, and death on the high seas. 5 glimpses into a world where your worst day at the office would seem like a vacation compared to an average Tuesday aboard a pirate ship. Thomas Whitmore, the surgeon's apprentice who watched children die in agony because he lacked the tools to save them. 30 days of hell, watching strong men reduced to corpses because infection was a death sentence in a world without antibiotics. William Black Bill Morrison, the quartermaster who calculated human suffering like an accountant tallying expenses. A man who decided who lived and who died based on productivity ratings, who recorded deaths with the same detachment other people used to track inventory. Isabella Rodriguez, the navigator whose single wrong decision killed 42 men during 60 days. Lost at sea, a brilliant woman reduced to guessing games with instruments that might as well have been magic 8 balls, watching her crew slowly starve and go mad while she projected confidence she didn't feel. Little Sam McBride, the 11-year-old powder monkey who lasted 127 days carrying explosives through combat zones. A child who died doing a job that grown men wouldn't attempt because pirates needed someone expendable to keep their cannons firing. And Captain Ezekiel Kane, who went from respected naval officer to religious fanatic in exactly 90 days. A man who proved that even the strongest minds could crack under the pressure of command when morality became a luxury you couldn't afford. These weren't fictional characters, mate. These were real people who lived and died in a world that would destroy your modern sensibilities in minutes. A world where a simple cut could kill you, where starvation was a management tool, where children were expendable resources, and where good men became monsters just to survive another day. You think you're tough because you've dealt with difficult customers, demanding bosses, or long work hours. You wouldn't last 5 minutes dealing with Big Mike's infected gunshot wound, watching the gangrene spread while Thomas tried desperately to save him with tools that belonged in a torture chamber. You think you could handle resource management under pressure? William Morrison made life-and-death decisions about food allocation, while men starved around him. And he did it with the cold efficiency of a bureaucrat processing paperwork. You think you could navigate by the stars using 18th century instruments? Isabella Rodriguez was arguably the best navigator of her era, and she still got lost so badly that her crew nearly resorted to cannibalism before they were rescued by pure chance. You think you could handle the responsibility of being a powder monkey? Little Sam was braver than most adults, and he still died carrying explosives through a war zone because someone had to do the job, and children were the only ones small enough and expendable enough to risk. You think you could maintain your sanity under the pressure of pirate command? Captain Kane was a decorated naval officer with years of leadership experience, and he still ended up trying to sacrifice crew members to appease voices in his head. The truth is, mate, you couldn't handle any of it. None of us could. We're soft, comfortable modern people who've never faced real hardship, real starvation, real desperation. We've never had to make decisions where every choice means someone dies. We've never had to watch children suffer because we lack the knowledge or tools to help them. And that's not a criticism, it's a blessing. You live in a world where a simple infection doesn't mean death, where getting lost means using GPS to find your way home, where children go to school instead of carrying explosives through combat zones, where madness is treated with therapy instead of mutiny. You live in a world where the worst pirates you encounter are the ones who cut you off in traffic or take too long at the coffee shop. Your greatest navigation challenge is finding a parking space. Your most difficult resource management decision is choosing between Netflix and Disney+. The pirates of the Golden Age weren't romantic heroes. They were desperate people living desperate lives in a world that offered them no better alternatives. They chose violence and uncertainty over poverty and oppression, and most of them died horribly for that choice. They drank rum because it was safer than water, not because they were party animals. They lived on ships because they had nowhere else to go, not because they loved adventure. They stole from others because they had no other way to survive, not because they were naturally criminal. Thomas Whitmore became a ship's surgeon because he thought his medical training would give him value and protection. He died trying to save people with tools that were barely better than Stone Age implements. William Morrison became a quartermaster because someone had to make the hard decisions about who lived and who died. He turned into a monster because the job required monstrous choices. Isabella Rodriguez became a navigator because she was brilliant and capable and thought she could master the challenges of oceanic travel. She learned that intelligence and skill meant nothing when you were working with instruments that were essentially sophisticated guessing devices. Little Sam became a powder monkey because he was small and expendable and had no choice in the matter. He died doing a job that was designed to kill the people who did it. Captain Kane became a pirate because he was desperate to save his family and thought his naval experience would make him successful. He discovered that commanding pirates required abandoning the moral principles that had made him a good naval officer. So as you drift off to sleep tonight in your comfortable bed, in your climate-controlled room, with clean water available at the turn of a tap and food in your refrigerator, remember the stories of these 5 people who lived and died in a harsher world. Remember Thomas, working by candlelight with bloody hands, trying to save men who were doomed by the limitations of their era. Let his dedication to healing, even in impossible circumstances, remind you to appreciate modern medicine and the people who practice it. Remember Bill Morrison, making terrible decisions with cold efficiency because someone had to choose who lived and who died. Let his story remind you that resource management isn't just about spreadsheets and budgets. Sometimes it's about survival itself. Remember Isabella, projecting confidence while wrestling with instruments that couldn't tell her where she was. Let her courage in the face of uncertainty remind you that leadership sometimes means admitting you don't have all the answers. Remember little Sam, carrying explosives through combat zones because someone had to do the job. Let his bravery remind you that children are capable of more than we often give them credit for, and that protecting them from unnecessary danger is one of our most important responsibilities. And remember Captain Kane, whose descent into madness showed that even good men can become monsters under enough pressure. Let his story remind you that mental health is precious, and that seeking help when you're struggling isn't weakness, it's wisdom. These pirates lived in a world where every day was a struggle for survival, where comfort was unknown, where death was always just a mistake away. They endured hardships that would break most modern people, and they did it without the support systems, medical care, or technological advantages that we take for granted. But they were still people. They had hopes and fears, dreams and nightmares, moments of kindness and cruelty. They loved and hated, succeeded and failed, lived and died as human beings trying to make the best of impossible circumstances. Their world is gone now, lost to history except for the records they left behind and the stories we tell about them. The age of piracy ended not because pirates were defeated, but because the world changed around them. Nations developed stronger navies, shipping became more organized, and legitimate opportunities for advancement replaced the desperate choices that drove men to piracy. You live in a better world, mate. A world where children go to school instead of war, where sickness is treated instead of endured, where getting lost means inconvenience instead of death, where madness is addressed instead of ignored, where hard choices are made by people with information and resources instead of desperate guesses. So sleep well tonight, knowing that the age of pirates is over, that their hardships are history, and that their suffering helped teach us how to build a more humane world. Sleep knowing that you're safe, comfortable, and living in an era where the greatest adventures are the ones you choose, not the ones forced upon you by circumstance and desperation. Sweet dreams, mate. And remember, if you survived these stories, tonight you're already tougher than you think, but you'll never need to be as tough as the pirates who lived them. The golden age of piracy is over. The age of comfort has begun, and that's exactly as it should be. If you made it through all of that maritime madness, you're already proving you've got more fortitude than most landlubbers. But before you drift off to sleep, here's something that'll keep you awake. Tomorrow, we're diving into the twisted tale of why pirates actually hated gold more than the plague itself, and what they preferred instead will make you question everything you thought you knew about treasure. These weren't the money-hungry swashbucklers Hollywood sold you. They were practical men who knew that gold was actually a curse that could get you killed faster than a Spanish warship. Want to know what they really valued? What they'd choose over chests of doubloons every single time? Hit that subscribe button now and join us tomorrow as we uncover the secret economics of piracy that'll change how you think about wealth, survival, and what really matters when you're living on borrowed time. Trust me, mate, after you hear what pirates actually treasured, you'll sleep tonight like a contented peasant who just discovered his moldy bread is actually the most valuable thing in the kingdom. Sweet dreams, and welcome to the real history they never taught you in school.